Hello Chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today! Today's mobile torture device is the 2018 Subaru BRZ. The BRZ and 86 twins are a slightly confusing mishmash with 3 separate generations of each twin and a different engine swap for each. This car, along with the 2016 Toyota 86, has the option for the LT5 engine from the C7 Corvette ZR1, capable of over 1100 horsepower once fully upgraded. That's not overkill at all. As usual, the Corvette STI has every upgrade, including the wide body and the increased body rigidity option, but none of the settings have yet been adjusted except for downforce, which is maxed, and the transmission, which has already been optimized for this car's slightly increased power output. The wheels are in the smallest available size. Larger wheels can slightly improve agility, but this can come at the expense of stability, especially over bumps and curves, so I preferred the smaller wheels. The Scooby Chevrolet has a front splitter for front downforce, a rear diffuser for front and rear downforce, and a custom wing set for maximum rear downforce. While the standard Boxer engine can make do with the Type A or B rear wings, I recommend you get the Big Ugly wing when trying the Big V8. If you're interested in learning more about aero, downforce, or any other aspect of tuning your car, I have a series called Tuning for Beginners which covers everything from suspension to differential to the transmission. The chosen track today was the Road Atlanta circuit. The car stood still, spinning its wheels at the start line for roughly 20 minutes or so before it managed to get going. The last car I tried this LT5 engine with was the Chevrolet Corvette C2, a car that is approaching retirement age. Much like that car, this dainty little sports car will merrily spin its wheels up to roughly 130 miles per hour. Approaching corners isn't as scary as you might expect. It's leaving them that's the issue. Like the MX-5 from the previous video, this car has far too much power for its tiny wheelbase and tries to spin like a top as soon as you touch the throttle. All of this is made much worse by the usual soft suspension settings. Despite this, I did manage to wrangle the car for 2 full laps of the circuit without any life-ending incidents, which shocked me more than anyone. That's it, stop in the middle of the road, you tosspot. In a move that will surprise nobody, I increased the natural frequency and I also increased the anti-roll bar stiffness. Both of these put together will reduce body roll, and the less exaggerated movements will hopefully make the car more predictable. Already, the car was transformed, though please don't mistake this for me saying that the car is now easy to drive. It's much better, but it is still quite shit. Thanks to a total lack of rear traction, it's still extremely prone to spinning its wheels, but it's much easier to predict when it's going to kick the tail out. In fact, despite the ridiculous power and wheel spin, this is quite a balanced car. Already I was finding this car easier to drive than the MX-5 from the previous video, despite this having 200 horsepower more. Next up, I adjusted the differential. I reduced acceleration sensitivity, which will slow down the transition to oversteer out of corners. I reduced braking sensitivity to make the brakes feel sharper, and I left the initial torque alone for now. The car felt subtly different. Oh, you inbred, mouth-breathing little cunt. Despite my opponent's best attempts to murder me, I managed to hold on. The car felt slightly less quick to oversteer, but the braking sensitivity changes left the car feeling slightly loose when braking, which you could see as a good or a bad thing depending on your driving style. Piss off. However, the car was still very difficult to control out of corners, and the lack of rear traction made for some very butt-puckering moments when going over crests. For my final set of changes, I made several tweaks. I increased compression, which usually helps over curves. I decreased camber, which should improve straight-line traction, hopefully reducing wheel spin as well as braking distances slightly. I added some front toe out, which generally improves stability and lift-off oversteer, and I added some rear toe in, which should reduce power oversteer. I then bit the bullet and added some ballast weight to the rear axle, since this car is never going to effectively put this much power down without it. The increase to the weight was the adjustment that made the biggest difference to the car's handling. Braking distances were slightly negatively affected, but the improved traction out of corners more than made up for it. The car was much easier to drive, though still very prone to wheel spin over 100 miles per hour. Since the car now felt somewhat reasonable, it was now time to see how it would handle at the Nurburgring. I made a few more tweaks which didn't seem to help much. What helped most was a few more kilos to the rear to prevent some more of that wheel spin. This Subaru, along with its Toyota twin, is another one of those engine swaps that's just a little bit too stupid to bother with or recommend. If the LS9 from the Corvette C6 was in its place, this car would make a better case for itself, with nearly 150 horsepower less and a fair bit less torque to melt the rear tyres. Not to mention, the LS9 sounds miles better than the LT5. Still, it's not as bad as you might think. I expected this car to behave just like the Mazda ND Roadster with the LT1 Stingray engine which I featured recently. If anything, I expected the Subaru to be worse, since the ZR1 engine has almost an extra 200 horsepower over the Stingray engine. Interestingly, this car is nowhere near as bad as the Miata Vet. It's still a very difficult car to get right because you have to be so careful with the accelerator inputs, though it's infinitely better than the turbo LS7 engine from the drift car, which I do not stop bitching about. This is because the LT5 is supercharged, so you know how much power you're going to get, even if it is far too much. Not having to account for turbo lag is quite the luxury after having driven a few LS7s. In the end, the Subaru managed a 6 minutes 20, barely beating the Alpine A110 with the R35 engine, along with the Mazda from the last episode. So, that was my attempt to tame a monster. I hope my settings helped, or that you enjoyed this video. Join me next time where I'm driving a car that's got the heart of an Italian. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're feeling particularly generous, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care, and ta-ra.